Hey friends, I'm Maxwell Freud, a queer Minneapolis-based game designer and the host of Hatch This Way, a limited audio series where I chat with other queer folks in the tabletop industry to learn all about who they are and how they contribute to the hobby by being their authentic selves. Today I am joined by the owner of Coyote and Crow Games, Connor Alexander. Connor, how are you doing?
I'm great. Thanks for having me. This is going to be really fun. I'm looking forward to this.
I'm really excited. I've so many things I want to ask you and dig into. So first of all, talk to me about how you identify as a human being.
I call myself, as one of my multiple labels, queer in the broadest sense of the term, along with being Cherokee, along with being non-monogamous. Yeah.
Okay, fun.
A long list of stuff. Those are the big ones.
Before we dig into it, just give me a quick more into like your title, and which we can also get into later. Sure. But just so people are aware, you're the owner of Coyote and Crow Games. Anything else that goes with that?
Absolutely, yeah. So I designed a tabletop role-playing game called Coyote and Crow over the last few years, and it became a runaway success. So as a publisher, as a game company owner, it was not something I really planned. It fell into my lap almost as a responsibility based on the success of Coyote and Crow. So my original ambition was never to be a game publisher. It was always about game design for me. And I felt that I had to step into this role and do it justice. So that's an accidental. And now we're bridging into tabletop games. We've got tabletop games releasing in the fall, and we're branching out much farther as a company than I had ever dreamed.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
So let's dig back into this giant queer identity bubble. Sure. Let's burst it a little bit. Break it down for me. So I want to know all the things.
Yeah. So to be really upfront, I really didn't give myself the queer label until probably 6 or 7 years ago. I grew up in a very classically straight household that had queers in it, and I didn't learn about that until later in my life, but it was one of those things you just didn't talk about. And I think there were a lot of signs early on that I was like the weird kid in the group of friends that I had. And I always approached things from a different angle than a lot of folks. And that definitely carried over into my very late blooming sexuality as a kid. I mean, I was one of those kids that, like, I did not have a girlfriend until I was 18. And even then it was awkward and I was stumbling through a lot of stuff. But I think what really clicked for me back in just slightly, so when I was late teen, early 20s, I was in the military. And going overseas and having that exposure, having just grown up in a very small bubble of Southern California and going overseas and seeing different cultures, different people, it was really a shock to my system. And I'd always been a person who considered myself open-minded. And yet at the same time, I grew up around two hyper masculine father figures who dropped the F slur a lot if you did anything that was unmasculine, anything that even vaguely approached femininity, or basically just anything they didn't understand. Anything that they didn't understand got the F label, both my stepfather and my father in that case. So going overseas and seeing a lot of different cultures and a lot of different perspectives on masculinity and femininity, and it was my first exposure to, at least to my conscious knowledge, my first exposure to both the drag scene and to other queer people. It was a push into the deep end of the pool. But it wasn't really until my mid-20s when I started dating somebody who I didn't know when I first approached them, but she was a professional dominatrix. And having my eyes open to the BDSM scene and everything that goes along with it, all of the wonderful ambrosia salad of people that are in the BDSM scene, that was another shock to my system. And I've always been a person who has an attitude, whether it's sex or people or anything. I've always been a person who says, try everything at least twice. Try everything at least twice to see what you like. And that has been a really important guidestone for me. I've made a lot of really great discoveries in life that way. But I think even in the throes of the BDSM community and being around all these wonderful people, I still completely thought of myself as straight. And I used to joke with my girlfriend at the time, the dominatrix, I used to say, I'm open to the idea of men and other options out there. I'll know it when I see it. And it took moving to New Orleans to change that. And have you ever spent any time in New Orleans?
I visited once briefly and it was a good time.
Oh, good. I'm glad you had a good time there. It's being there in the mid to late 90s was a very unusual time. And it's got a great scene down there. The time I was really involved in the goth industrial scene there. And I don't know how familiar you are with the goth industrial scene, but it's got a great crossover with the queer and the gay scene. There's a lot of overlap on that Venn diagram. And I was able to meet a lot of folks who I think really opened my eyes to the idea of not trying to pocket people into specific labels so much. And the idea that there was a lot more gray area and a lot more overlap. And that was the point at which I think I started making out with some of my male friends in bars. And it started off as a lark and a joke. And I realized, I think at that point, that while I wasn't traditionally attracted to men in the same way that I was women, that in itself was not a problem. I used to think, if I'm not attracted to women the way I'm attracted to men, then I'm not attracted to men. And I think at that point I started to question myself a little bit more. And I think for a lot of folks, myself included, I think that kind of growth parallels a lot of other growth in your life, right? Like, I've got a long journey to tell you about. I can tell you about my journey with my reconnection to my Indigenous roots, my political leanings, how ridiculously far left I've gotten as I've gotten older. So I think there's a whole string of journeys that were happening there at the same time. And one question would lead to another. And I think the real moment that it clicked for me that I was not the person that I thought I'd been all those years was, and if you'll indulge me on a quick story, was I was working at a record store, a big chain record store, and I was plainclothes security at the time. And I was also DJing at the time and doing a bunch of other stuff. And I recently become non-monogamous, and I was with my first partner, and she was amazing. And she'd been really encouraging me to spread my wings and meet other folks. And there was a new employee at the record store that I really liked, and she and I had been talking, and I really wanted her to meet my partner. At that point, I was in love with the idea of compersion. So I wanted all my partners to meet each other and enjoy each other and have this good time. So I was DJing at an 80s night. And I said, why don't you both come down to the 80s night and we can all meet and hang out? And so that went great. And I'm in the booth and I'm DJing, and I come down for a break, and my partner takes me aside and she says, your date, she's a little scared right now, and she told me something that she was afraid to tell you. And I was like, oh God, what's going on? Are we talking like STDs here? Like what's happening? And she says she's trans. And I was completely blown away. I had no clue. There was no obvious signs there. And she said she was really terrified to tell you, which immediately felt crushing to me. Oh God, what have I done, or what has happened in her life that she felt afraid to tell me? And thankfully, she felt comfortable enough to tell my partner. And it took probably the rest of the evening, during my DJ breaks, the rest of the evening for my date and I to get through that conversation and to allow her to feel comfortable, which was my primary concern. Was I wanted her to feel comfortable and safe. But at the same time, I was dealing with my own reaction to it, or I guess more to the point, my lack of reaction, which is what really surprised me. I'd never entertained or not entertained dating someone who was trans before. And by the end of the night, we'd made out and had a great time. It's still probably one of my most memorable kisses ever. Oh man, could she kiss. Anyway, that's a different story. But I think from that point, that sort of burst the last little bubble I had in my head of trying to draw circles around things, of feeling like I had to define myself in one way or another. I didn't know she was trans, and post that conversation, I didn't care. And it didn't change my attraction to her. And still glad we're in touch to this day. She's amazing. But even then, I didn't call myself queer. And I think that boils back to a sense of feeling like I didn't measure up. I wasn't queer enough to call myself queer, because I saw folks who were good friends of mine who were more open in their life in a way that, like, I'm with a partner, I'm with a woman, I'm dating her, I'm a white passing man. I can go out and pass for just a cis het couple anytime I want, and I'm not going through any struggles. And so I think seeing folks who were more outwardly queer, more outwardly gay, those struggles that they were dealing with were something that I couldn't relate to. And I felt like that meant that I couldn't call myself queer. Mm-hmm. And I think it was probably around 2016 when I entered the game community, the board game industry, and started hanging out with those folks and realizing that I think I was doing the queer community a disservice by keeping all of that shut in and not communicating it more, because there is that sense of community. There is that sense of, oh, we all have that view of the gray area and those unique things that make us all just a little bit different. So yeah, it took me a long time to feel comfortable saying I was queer. And even then, I'm careful about how I use it because I feel like still even today, and maybe this is my age showing, but I do feel like the word queer is loaded depending on the group that you're in. Yeah, that was a
No,
bit
for
long,
sure.
but yeah.
No, that was great. Hey, that's why we're here. Yeah, I think it hits differently when you are able to put people behind some of these like labels that we thought we understood or had internal biases that we
Yeah.
didn't realize.
Yeah,
I think
absolutely.
one of my really close friends recently messaged me and was like, "Hey, I just wanted to talk to you about he identifies as cishet." And then he's like, I was just hanging out with some friends and one of the person's like trans femme. And knowing that, I'm still very attracted to them. And I don't really care that I'm still very attracted
Yeah.
to them. And he's like, I think that kind of changes maybe how I identify. And I was like, that's cool. Like, whatever.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like you're still, it's totally your thing. However
Yeah.
you want to
Absolutely.
navigate it and identify, I'm here for it. And that's totally
Yeah, labels
Yeah.
should be there to help each other communicate. But the minute they're a hindrance, I'm like, I start chucking labels. Like the minute they feel like they box me in, I want them gone. You know?
Yeah, for some people it helps form their identity, and for some people don't, and that's okay.
Yeah.
Like you don't have to identify. I think that's why queer has been reclaimed. It's a good umbrella term
Yes.
for other, not the
Absolutely.
social
Doesn't fit
cishet.
into a box easily.
Yeah, awesome. So I think going off that, talk to me a little bit about you growing up and then reconnecting with your, would you say Native American or is it
Yeah,
Indigenous?
Cherokee.
Is there a
Yeah,
preference
Cherokee. Yeah.
in terms of those two terms though?
Indigenous is fine. I would be fine with that.
Sure.
But I'm Cherokee and citizen of the Cherokee Nation of Oklahoma. There's actually 3 recognized tribes, of Cherokees. But yeah, so that's an interesting one because it ties a lot in with my queerness, I think, in a sort of a hard to define way. So my parents divorced when I was young, and my father is both Mexican and Cherokee and is deeply ashamed of both. I didn't realize this till much later in life, but that's mostly due to my grandfather, who was also deeply ashamed of his Mexican heritage. And I think those two aspects of my heritage, I think there was a calling for me when I was younger because I was raised by my mother, who was very generically white. And I don't mean that as a slam on my mom, but that side of the family almost didn't care about culture or identity. They're very like post-Depression era white American. And they didn't really have a claim to anything or an interest even in anything that was cultural. But for me, right away, the moment that I found out that I had Cherokee heritage on my father's side, and I must have been, I don't know, 4 or 5, or I don't know, whenever I started asking my first questions about identity and heritage, I glommed onto that really hard. And I pushed to spend more time with my grandmother, who was proud of her heritage and would share things with me. But the distance between my father, who was my primary connection to my father's side of the family, became more and more strained. And I've never really had a good relationship with him, despite really trying hard to maintain that relationship. But I think anything related to his cultural background was something that he wanted to bury in a face of whiteness. So I think anytime I brought that stuff up, it was a sore spot for him, and it was something he avoided. And then eventually my mother and my stepfather and I moved away. We were living in Southern California at the time in a town called Rialto. We eventually moved to Bakersfield, California, which physically removed me further from my Cherokee relatives. And I struggled with trying to connect my identity for a long time. This is pre-internet. There's not a whole lot of ways for me to do it. And I eventually got a hold of some documentation from my grandfather. My grandmother had passed. She died when I was 16. And I got a hold of some documentation that related to my Cherokee heritage. And through that documentation, I was able to gain my citizenship and started trying to pursue that a little more. But it really wasn't until the internet era that I was able to start digging in further and making connections. And I'm actually really, it's one of those weird small world coincidences that a long chain of events led to basically me discovering that an aunt on my father's side and a whole bunch of my cousins moved to Seattle, which is where I'm at now. and they'd been here for years. And I did not discover them until about 2 or 3 years ago. And now connecting with my cousins who are both deeply involved in their Indigenous heritage has been such an amazing blessing. Like, it has been fantastic for me to connect with them. And that combination of culture and family tying me back to them has been amazing. I'm also really lucky that just a few weeks ago, I was able to take a extremely long road trip, a 47-day road trip that included 3 weeks in Tahlequah, Oklahoma, where my reservation is, and spend time there and diving into historical records and going on long hikes and just being around fellow Cherokees. Like, just the concept of sitting down at a table with 2 other Cherokees who I was not related to at a bar, where there are signs written in Cherokee on the streets. It's hard for me to describe that feeling when I've never had it, and I'm coming up on 52, and that sense of connection. And I think that's what's lacking a lot in America right now. I don't want to go off on a political diatribe, but I think there's such a sense of individualism as a priority within American culture. And I think we see this in queer communities as well. There's this need for chosen community because we've broken away from traditional community structures so much that it becomes really important to find a chosen family. So that feeling for me of stepping back in almost a doorway into the past for me and sitting down with fellow Cherokees and just talking was lovely. But it's a long road to reconnection. I think if you talk to any Native American, especially from tribes that were displaced due to colonialism, you're going to see that a lot of them, I don't know percentages, but I know it's a damn good percentage of Cherokees live off the reservation and have lived off the reservation their whole life. How many of them have a long road to get back to feeling like they're part of their own tribe again? You could almost do a whole series, frankly, on that, because there's a lot of intertribal stuff going on there.
Yeah, no, for sure. I think to give you a little background, because I think I've come to realize I had a unique exposure growing up. So there was a woman in our church who cleaned houses. So my parents would hire her when I was a child. And whenever I was like, if it was a weekend or if I was home sick, she was a professional storyteller and she was Native American. And so she would sit down and she would share with me in this like extremely rehearsed and ceremonious way. She would tell these stories to me that she had passed down to her through her elders. And so that was something that I experienced growing up, was this woman just sharing these really beautiful stories from her culture. And I grew up in the middle of Wisconsin, so I don't know specifically what tribe she was from.
Yeah, there's a lot of overlap in that area. There's a lot.
Yeah, we have Ho-Chunk is a bigger one, but that's a little further west, I think. I'm in Minnesota now, so the big tribes, I think they're all kind of part of the Anishinaabe. And then like Ojibwe specifically within that. But so I grew up in Wisconsin, and Boy Scouts, ironically, it seems to be a common thing, where one of my friends growing up in Boy Scouts, he was Native American. So his mother would pull a lot of strings to get us into ceremonial ceremonies. I actually went to powwows and they like brought us in and had us dance with them. And it was just like this weird thing where I thought it was normal. And I didn't really understand what I was witnessing or how special some of that was at the time. I was like very much a kid. It was like just a really cool thing I experienced growing up. And then I recently worked at a news station, and one of the newscasters took time to actually focus on Native American stories. And it was really cool to see there are a lot of tribes and reservations in Minnesota that are trying to reconnect with the culture that has erased or lost. You're right. It's a whole nother series to unpack the generational trauma.
Our game company's slogan is decolonize your gaming. I think there's so many colonized assumptions permeates every level of our culture.
Yeah. I think there's a new movement, I think is what I learned by watching these stories of Millennial and Gen Z. I think it might be due to some of the internet access and the communication avenues that way to reconnect with each other and their history, to try and bring back languages that are almost lost for the most part, and stories and practices. It's really cool stuff. And I think what also sticks out to me from things I've just learned and trying to be more aware of other marginalized groups is listening to a lot of true crime podcasts the amount of crime targeted at Indigenous people, specifically female and specifically trans women in Indigenous communities or surrounding, the rates are horrific. And it's hard to concept that if you're a trans Indigenous woman, you have like a 1 in 3 chance of walking outside and being assaulted or killed. It's wild. So when you reached out, I was super excited to try and give some voice to Indigenous people, because I feel like it's, in my opinion, probably one of the most overlooked or forgotten groups, which is not a new phenomenon, but I think people insert you into BIPOC and they don't really know or like realize they're putting it in there, like what that means.
It's true. It's true. I think,
because I feel like it was the POC for a while, and then they're like BIPOC.
Yeah.
Like, oh yeah, them too.
I love it when we make the umbrellas bigger, right? I'm all about making bigger umbrellas. Yeah, and it's hard because going back to the game industry side of things, part of the reason that I pushed myself to do this, so I was working as a non-creative in the game industry prior to Coyote Crow. I both managed a game store and then I worked as an account manager for a distributor. So I was dealing with a lot of the backside of the industry with publishers and dealing with getting games out into the world. And I was seeing hundreds of games a year, either how just completely absent Indigenous representation was, both in the content of the games and then on the development team side. But even when it was there, it was usually either horribly misrepresented or there was a sense of maybe the designers got a rubber stamp from somebody. They were white designers, white artists. They finished the product and they gave it to somebody and they said, "Is this offensive?" And somebody said yes or no. And that's the level of the sort of development it got regarding Indigenous folks. And so I think for me, it was a case where I almost felt like a responsibility to step in and say, hey, there's some stories to be told here. I mean, as you mentioned before, Indigenous folks, man, we have millennia of being some of the best storytellers out there. And I thought it was a perfect match for us to do a role-playing game as our first game and just build out that world, because I really think there are a lot of Native folks out there right now who have stories they want to tell, and their stories in their way. And I didn't want them to have to do it with a rule set that was based on colonial ideas. So between myself and my writing team, I think we came up with a pretty good solution there. So I'm pretty pleased with the way Coyote Crow came out, and I'm floored the response.
Yeah, I think one thing that's interesting to try and understand about the Native American culture having a comeback is that because of the colonial practices of not only the genocide of Native people, but then also brainwashing,
indoctrination into American culture versus their traditional cultures.
And so I feel like there's from that this passed down ingrained shame of their own identity. And then the movement of younger people trying to reconnect is a huge deal, because trying to heal a lot of that was never their fault.
So I mean, my great grandmother was encouraged to leave the reservation by her own family. They said, "There's no hope for you here. Go marry a white guy." That's the level of shame and despair a lot of folks were feeling. Especially turn of the century was not a great time for, prior to that obviously was bad too, but turn of the century was a pretty depressing time for a lot of Indigenous folks. And it's taken us a long route, 70s, 80s, 90s, when we're still dealing with legislation that should have been handled 100 years ago or more. And now, even with decisions like the Huerta decision that the Supreme Court just overturned, we're facing setbacks. We're going in the wrong direction for Indigenous sovereignty. It's a long battle. And then on top of it, colonialization did such a number, I think, on folks where I'll give you a great example. I have a number of folks who have approached me and said, I have a grandmother who was so-and-so, and then they'll name a tribe, but I wasn't raised that way, so I don't talk about it. And my thought is, I get it, because you're trying to be respectful and you're trying not to appropriate culture. That's completely fair. At the same time, from my perspective, what I hear you saying is that person is speaking to their ancestor and going, I'm choosing to turn my back on you. And to me, that is heartbreaking. If that grandmother saw their grandchild just turn the back and go, you know what, I'm walking away from your culture, what would that grandmother have said? And so I'm not saying people should turn around and try to get benefits or claim anything, but face the other direction. Turn around and investigate your culture a little bit. I think that the only way that any tribe is going to survive. And Cherokees are one of the biggest. We've got a huge population base. So I understand this from that perspective, is if we can get people re-engaging with their cultures and with their past, if we keep having people just go, that's part of my past, I'm not going to deal with it, that's fewer native speakers we have, that's fewer people who understand the culture, and it's more people, especially with the use of things like blood quantum, it's fewer people we have in the tribe, and it's just a slow form of genocide. If you're out there listening, please engage with your culture, engage with it. I'm not saying take benefits or take anything away from anybody else, but please engage.
So you mentioned that interaction. Have you had positive interactions and feedback from putting out the game?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. When I originally set my goals for the Kickstarter, it was, I think, an $18,000 goal. I was expecting to print maybe 300 books and maybe have 50 or so donated. We ended up over $1 million on the Kickstarter, and we're donating more than 5,000 books. But while those numbers were great, I think what was far more impressive to me were the number of emails I received from folks who were just saying things like, I'd never thought I'd see a game like this in my lifetime. And I didn't even know I needed this game or wanted this game. I've had schools and libraries reach out to me and saying that they're adding it to their collections. We're going to be speaking at a Museum of Native American History later this year. They're doing a whole thing on Indigenous futurisms. So just being included in those conversations to me is far more than I ever thought I would be dealing with. So I'm beyond flattered. And I think it points to a real need there. There's a hunger there that I think it's reflected in things like how people reacted to Black Panther when it first came on. It spoke to white audiences, sure, but there was just a huge, I think, hunger there hidden underneath the pop culture strata of the Black community needing that kind of imagery up on the screen and that kind of story with that framework. And I would love to see a Coyote Crow movie or television. I think the world that we've built here is, I intentionally structured it as a sandbox for other Indigenous folks to be able to tell their stories in. And that's all I really want from the game, is for folks to feel like they can step up and be storytellers of their own.
I think we're at a shortage of good Native representation anywhere in media, especially. So there's plenty of room for it.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. We've got authors like Rebecca Rowanhorse and Stephen Graham Jones. I'm really loving Stephen's work right now. His horror stuff is fantastic if you're ever into reading horror. And then we've got some great TV, Sterling Harjo's Reservation Dogs and stuff like Rutherford Falls. So I think there's a lot of great stuff out there that's being eaten up. And I think for a long time, too, I think there's a fear, especially from white liberals, to engage with Indigenous culture on anything more than a surface level. Again, it goes back to that fear that they're being appropriative. And it's something actually that I experienced from a lot of white players or white potential players for Coyote and Crow, is that they're afraid to play the game because they don't want to be inconsiderate or rude or step on any toes. And what I always tell folks is there's a huge difference between taking something from a culture and being offered something from a culture. And that's what I think both Reservation Dogs and Rutherford Falls do really well, is they offer up culture and say, see, look, here's our differences, but there's plenty to share here. There's plenty of things you're going to relate to, too. You don't have to be an Indian to like Rutherford Falls. You absolutely do not. And I think it's the same with Coyote and Crow, because there's plenty in there for any sci-fi fan or fantasy fan. And it's being offered to you. Take it.
Before we dive full on into gaming topic, let's circle back real quick, because I think just how does the queer aspect of your identity tie into your culture and maybe even the game itself or the games that you play?
Yeah, I'll let you know when I have a full answer to that question, but here's my partial answer, because I am still exploring the bridge between those two things. I think on a very surface level, and I'm going to speak very broadly here, pan-Indian, and I don't really like doing that, but in general, Native cultures have always had a lot more acceptance of queer and broad spectrum of identities and approaches to sexuality. I think a lot of that was squashed by colonialism. And so much so that there's now a lot of baked in misogyny to a lot of tribes and nations right now, which is an absolute shame. And I'm sure that it feeds into what we were just talking about earlier about missing and murdered Indigenous women. There's no doubt that sort of misogyny cooked into our cultures for centuries has done real damage. But where I come back to it is that I'm trying really hard in my design side to work with more people across the queer spectrum and across the two-spirit spectrum, and bringing those voices into, so Two-Spirit, by the way, I'm sure you're probably familiar, but for listeners' sake, Two-Spirit is an identity claimed by some native cultures. I'm pretty sure it originated as an Ojibwe phrase, but it's used pan-Indian now to indicate a cultural crossover between Indigenous beliefs and being queer. On various levels. Some folks use it as a substitute for trans, but it's its own thing, which is one of the reasons in the game that we ask that non-Indigenous folks don't use the tag of Two-Spirit on their characters in the game, just because that would be cultural appropriation. But getting those voices into Coyote and Crow is really important for me because they're an aspect that I can't directly relate to on a one-on-one basis. And every time I've had an interaction with a Two-Spirit person in Coyote and Crow, it's given me a much broader understanding of both their cultural identity, but also a peek into my own. And I'm working now on bridging those two. And that's another part of my reconnection journey, is seeing where those two meet. It'll be interesting to see where that goes. Not really sure.
No, that's cool though. I love that. Now let's delve into the game stuff, because I know you're super excited about it. Talk to me a little bit how you got into games. Did you find them? Why did you stick around?
I had a slightly older uncle who was like a brother. I was raised in my grandmother's house. And so I had a slightly older uncle who really, since he was the youngest kid in the family and he wanted a younger kid to pick on, roped me into that dynamic. But he was really great about teaching me board games from right out of the gate. I think I learned chess at around 4. And so I started slowly developing a broader appreciation of games as I got into my teens. By the time I was, I think, 12, I was playing Dungeons and Dragons. I've always been a creative person and a storyteller, and I was often taking on the role of Dungeon Master when we played D&D. And it wasn't even on my radar as something I could have done as a career. Not at all. I spent time as a DJ and a nightclub owner. I eventually got a degree in film and television. And well into my 40s, I was not thinking of gaming as a career. I was doing it more often. I was playing the games more often. But it wasn't until I got laid off in 2012 and I had an offer to volunteer at an international tabletop day for a game store that was going to be opening in my neighborhood. And I volunteered and I had a fantastic time. The place ended up being called Meeple's Games here in West Seattle. And they offered me a job after that volunteer day. They said, we're looking for staff. And I think that first day of working in a game store, it was absolutely like a light bulb went on, because I all of a sudden realized that I had this passion for games that I had been keeping solely within the circle of my friends that I played with. And I quickly realized that there was a real joy for me in standing there talking to a stranger about a game that I'd really had a good time with and why I think they might like it, and trying to connect the right people to the right game, which is a real art form. If you've ever worked in a game store, or even if you just try to pitch a game to somebody at a table, finding a fit for them, their skill level, their play style, all of those things come into it, their personality, trying to find a game that matches them, and the joy on their face when they come back and they're like, we loved this game. We loved it so much. Please give us another suggestion. So I really enjoyed working at a game store. And it wasn't long before I got recruited by a company called PSI that does game distribution. And I was originally brought on as part of a retailer relations initiative. So I was dealing a lot with retailers all over the country. And eventually I started working with publishers. And I think I have a good understanding of game demographics and what audience a game might reach. And I think that helped me leapfrog into developing my own game. And specifically, what brought it on was a video game called Greedfall. There was a video game that came out in, I guess it came out in 2017 or so. I'd have to go back and look. But I remember seeing the trailer for it. And it was this idea of steampunk Victorian England that's under the yoke of a horrible plague. And the only way that they can find a cure for the plague is to go over to this new world and take the medicine from the mystical savages. And my jaw literally fell open. This was like 2017. I was watching this, and I said, I need to do something. I need to put my hat into the ring on this and take some action. And so that was the birth of Coyote and Crow. And it took me 2 years to really find not only the game that I wanted to build and to develop it myself, but to bring in the writers and the artists that I wanted to work with. And I think that's probably one of the most heartbreaking parts of my story, my challenge here, is that it took me that long to find the right people. It's not that there aren't creative Indigenous folks out there, it's that they're all doing day jobs and they don't have the time to deal with my silly little social media circles. And they're working hard, and their passions and their creativity are buried underneath day jobs. And so finding those people and finding that bridge between I'm an amateur who can make the time and has the skill set to become a professional on the one end, finding the right people to do that, or the few professionals who are already busy and completely ensconced in whatever their career is, how do they make time for a little project like mine? And finding the overlap between those two is very tough. I'm really happy to say that I'm slowly cultivating a small little team of writers and artists that I love working with. I hope I can keep working. But yeah, that was a 3-year journey between the start of building it and the success of the Kickstarter. And it, like I said at the beginning of this, when it took off, I had no idea it was going to go this big. And once I got even over 500,000, quite frankly, at that point, I realized I could just produce the books, take this money and walk away and just go back to my day job. I could do that, absolutely. But I felt like there was an opportunity here, and I think I used the word responsibility at the beginning. I definitely think it is one, a responsibility to hold the door open for others and to say, hey, I've got this opportunity and a voice and a platform, and maybe we can get some more Indigenous designers and artists and writers into the game industry with this door being held open. And I'll be honest, I don't like being a publisher. I am not a good business person. I hate it, actually. But it is giving me hopefully an opportunity to also be a creative again down the line. Like, it's giving me some opportunity. I'll bear that for a little while longer.
Oh, for sure. I totally, very similar situation where I was at Gen Con. I was like, something needs to change. I'm not seeing myself. I had a weird interaction. I talk about it in the first episode, but I was like, yeah, I could complain or I could do something. I'll just do something. I'm a professional creative designer person. Like, I can do this. If not me, then who? Hopefully a lot of people, but I can, therefore I should. I totally get that.
Yeah.
And then, trying to make the space and find the people, I think, that's totally the goal of trying to bring the people into that space that you want to help lift up and get their voices.
Well, I think this show is a great example of that. So kudos to you for this show. Like, when I heard about it, I thought it was a fantastic idea. I think Brenna was the only person I knew from your initial cast. But when you announced the other folks that you were doing for this next season, I loved it because I knew almost everybody in there. And I was like, oh, these are great people. I can't wait to listen to their shows. So it was great all around. It was great hearing new people and great knowing that friends are coming on board.
Yeah, it's going way longer than I intended, but it's been really awesome. Yeah, I had a similar thing with one of my recent guests where they had listened to the podcast and so they like knew things about me, which was really weird.
It is, isn't it?
Like, that's what happens when you have a platform. And I was like, oh God, I have a platform now. And I was like, I'm like, God, I did take like a moment to be like, I need to recognize that people listen to this. Like, it's a thing that I could use to do positive things or set us back. But definitely feel the responsibility aspect of it.
Yeah. Which is weird. It's both like an honor, and then there's this also like this great fear that you're going to drop the ball, right? The balance between terror and privilege.
I could keep saying ignorant things because no one knew who I was, but now people know who I am. I just have to be more aware of the things I'm saying, which is a good thing.
And now I get the privilege of being called out on my ignorant things. Like, strangers are going to come up and correct me.
Oh, they will tell me. So talk to me about your goal going forward. I think you've covered it
kind of briefly at the beginning, I think. Yeah, I think for me, as far as games go, is I'm really trying hard to bridge the gap between role-playing games and tabletop games. My goal is to not only get more Indigenous folks involved in the creation of games, but more Indigenous folks playing games that are outside of the traditional colonial elements. I want to get them away from Monopoly and just the traditional games and start seeing that there is a way to bring Indigenous values into board gaming. And the part of the problem with a role-playing game is that it's such a high barrier to entry, right? It's a $70 book, and it can be intimidating for a lot of people. So what I'm trying to hopefully do is start quickly bridging into board games that are family accessible that your hardcore gamer Indian nerd can sit down with his auntie or his grandma and play at the kitchen table and bring them into modern board gaming. And so we're working hard on those fronts. As fun as it is to impress the hobby board game crowd and the folks at Gen Con and everything else, they are not my real true target audience. They are a byproduct for me. I'll consider myself successful when I really start seeing some of my games start to appear on reservations or where Native Americans can buy products traditionally, and I see my games there. That's when I know I'm doing some really good work. So those are sort of my long-term goals. We'll see if they happen. I mean, in this crazy world right now with everything that's going on, I think board games can be tough to put on the priority list for some folks, but I don't know. We'll see.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting time. Like during pandemic was a great time to break out some board games, and there was a lot of interest from people who wanted to get into the hobby at that point. Now post pandemic, I think it's a good break from screens. That's why I like board games, is I get screened out, and so I love having an experience I can share with people that doesn't involve us all staring. So totally get that.
I feel like there's, at least for me personally, there's a sense of recharge that comes from playing on board games, especially during the COVID era when I spent so much time cooped up. If I get a chance to spend a couple of hours with friends around a game table, I come away feeling real recharged, even when I lose every single game, which is often.
Yeah, we should play games together and we can lose together.
Cheers to that.
I also lose every game. Yeah, I think for me, I very much want to have the representation out there, but I think my personal goal is just to hopefully move the needle so that it becomes more broadly accepted. This is the norm, is you need to have queer designers and queer stories in your catalog to be relevant. Like I hope that becomes
absolutely. Yes,
the goal, like for me personally. And then whatever I can do to uplift other queer voices, that's like my short-term goal. Long-term goal.
We've got a novel coming out. I had an author approach me. Actually, she didn't approach me. We spoke together about the idea of doing a Coyote Crow novel. And they asked me early on in the discussions how I felt about the idea of all three main protagonists being women. And I said, that's brilliant. That's brilliant. Please, like we've got enough male-centric stuff in here, and having all three be women creates a lovely dynamic. And that was the reason that I asked my cover artist I said, I would really like somebody who is femme presenting on the cover, and then somebody else who is non-binary or two-spirit presenting on the cover. And I think we accomplished that. And I'm shocked, actually, that nobody yet has called me out on that or said anything, like commented negatively or positively. They've all liked the cover, but no one has commented specifically on the characters yet. And I don't know whether that means that I did such a good job that no one noticed, or that I don't know. Yeah, I'm surprised the alt-right trolls haven't called me out on that one yet either. But
they're probably not aware, because again, that I in BIPOC is
yeah, that's true.
They're like, oh, we forgot to attack the eyes. We're so busy attacking the bees.
Yes, exactly. They got a lot of work to do with the bees. They'll get to the eyes later.
Yeah. Is there anything you're seeing in the industry or hobby space specifically that is giving you hope for the future, or gives you those positive vibes of you're seeing progress in terms of inclusion, good representation?
I will say that there's a couple of trends that I really like. First of all, I really like the fact that even in mass market games with this stuff on Target shelves and things like that, you're seeing more and more designers being listed on the game boxes. And that's not necessarily an inclusion thing broadly, but I do like the concept that the people who created the games are getting a little more recognition than just the publisher of the games. I think that's an important start. And that leads to my second thing, which is because I am seeing a lot more women designers getting recognition. And I think that's an important first step, because this has been such a boys' club for so long. And I think that first step is getting to that stage where nobody even takes note that it's a woman designer, right? We just need to go, oh, it's a woman designer, who cares? That's the goal, right? We're still not there yet, because we still have to just point out every time a woman gets a successful game, which is obnoxious. But it's in the right direction, at least. So yeah, women and getting names on boxes, I think, is both great. Both of those are headed in the right direction. Where I think we're still really lacking is in any designers of color getting the recognition they deserve. Even if you're really involved in this hobby, you can probably name 4 or 5 designers of color who have any recognition. And that is a shame. That is a real shame, because I think there, again, like going back to with Coyote and Crow, like the idea that there are a lot of storytellers out there that have great stories. These are stories and ideas that are being missed due to the systemic issues involved in the hobby industry and media industries in general. But I have to hope that things like Coyote and Crow are pushing us in the right direction. But I don't want to end this on a down note. So we've got to move to an up note before the end here. I will say that I'm still seeing a lot of publishers do the nothing but the consultant thing on the end. And that is, to me, that is too little too late. It used to be like 10 years ago, having a consultant was good enough. I don't think it is anymore. I think you need a designer in at the ground level of designing a game who understands and represents the culture that you are strapping into your game. And an example I gave when it comes to Indigenous game design is it's not just about whether or not the theme you strap on at the end is accurate. It's that if you'd had an Indigenous designer on at the beginning, your mechanics might have been different. They might have been different from the start in a way that reflected your theme better. And that just leads to better sales and better games, and it's better for everyone. Please, if you're a designer out there, get your folks in on the ground floor, not at the end. Yeah, but let's end on a positive note.
Yeah, I think I just edited one episode, and that was totally the thing is I think people need to understand that when you get people from different lived experiences, we look at design and problems and we see different solutions and avenues. I think the impression is that it's a game. We're going to end up with a game, the same game regardless.
Yes.
And to challenge that instinct in your brain of saying, I can put a theme on it and I'm still going to end up with a game. Like everything you just said is if you brought in a person with a different lived experience and a different background, you might end up with a much richer, better, more unique game.
Yes.
It might be harder to market initially, but it's probably going to sell really well if people latch onto it and it resonates with them.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
If you want to end up on a super fun note, we can circle back because I skipped a question that I normally ask.
Oh, sure.
And that is, what are the games that you love? What are your go-tos? Or would you like to recommend to people?
Oh, that's a good one. Okay. So my favorite game to this day is Android Netrunner. While I'm not a super competitive person in general, that game was so thematic for me. And so it captured everything I loved about the cyberpunk genre without ever falling into the bad tropes of the cyberpunk genre. There's amazing cultural representation in there from across the gender and sexuality spectrum, but then also the global cultural perspective. And the mechanics in that are, just chef's kiss. They are amazing. So I still go back to that game all the time. It's the only game I've ever traveled for a championship for. I traveled to Minnesota, went up to Fantasy Flight Games.
Oh, gosh.
Yeah.
Oh, my gosh. All the way down to my neck of the woods.
Yep. I used to live in Minneapolis, by the way, and I love Minneapolis. It is one of my favorite cities to this day, and I love when I get to go back. The other games that I'm really enjoying right now are Dune from Legendary. The recent Dune game is a great action or worker placement and deck builder. It's a little on the heavy side, so you need a couple hours. And then the other one is Creature Comforts from Kids Table Board Games. Have you played that one? Or are you familiar?
I have not, but one of my other guests mentioned it as she plays it with one of her kiddos.
Oh, great.
That's one of their popular games in the house.
Yeah, it's such a, I think right now, especially in the tone of the world we're living in, the idea of playing a cute little woodland critter and just making a nice home for yourself for the winter, it just brings your blood pressure way down.
No, I think that's Kid Table Games, right?
Yeah, Kids Table Board Games, yeah.
Kids Table Board Games, yeah.
Yeah, KT, I think they go by KTBG.
Yeah. We can Google it, but no, I love their stuff. I think the quality of all their games, like the art and everything, is always on point.
Yeah, great crew over there too. Good people, very good people.
Excellent. That was fun. Yay. We love games. Oh my God. I appreciate you coming on and sharing your experience and your stories with us. As a disclaimer at the end here, I just want to remind everyone that we are just a couple of queer folks and we do not speak for the entire LGBTQI+ community, nor are we trying to. The best way to be an ally is just keep learning, listening. Remember, we're trying to get through this together. That's all I have. If you're listening, know that you're loved and perfect just the way you are. And until next time, bye. Say bye, Connor.
Bye.